All right, so let's look at chapter 8 today. And this is starting in with the economic changes that are happening in the country in the early to mid 1800s. A lot of it's dealing with technology, changes in transportation, and labor. Okay, so we're going to be putting all that together in chapter 8. Okay. All right, hang on. Let me get everything situated here. All right. So with chapter 8, these economic transformations, like I said, there's a new economic order that forms, which is more or less the hierarchy within the social classes. And a lot of that has to do with production. And each region of the country begins to specialize in their part of the production and their part of our national economy. And we'll look at a map of that in just a few minutes. You can see here one of the canals that's, excuse me, been constructed that's right next to the production facilities. And so it just cuts down on the transportation cost to be able to add all of that directly onto a barge or a boat that's right here in the canal. And you don't have to pay to transport it across land anywhere. So much of this promotion of the economy, we know, goes back to the ideas of Alexander Hamilton trying to shift from a purely agricultural society to one that's a little bit more diversified and allowing the U.S. to export more than it imports. So this is all going to hinge on private ownership of property and individual opportunity, that you can make your own economic situation what you want it to be. So if you have access to owning your own business or owning your own property, then you're going to get involved in this idea of the market revolution and trade. And if you don't, if you want to just sit there and be lazy, then that's on you, right? So this opportunity for everybody needs to be available. So this is also tied to the ideas of the Republican form of government, where people have freedom to make those decisions. Look what George Washington has to say here. Freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. So if you've got your own property, then you have the freedom to determine your own destiny, because you can work with that. All of this taken together, we refer to as neo-mercantilist policies. Neo meaning new. Mercantilist policies would be, how does the government regulate these particular parts of the economy? How does the government regulate private property? How does the government regulate and encourage marketing exchange? So those policies are going to be fairly new in this shift in the direction that the economy will take from being purely agriculture to be one that's a blend of agriculture and industry. One of those areas that you need for a new business is the idea of capital. Capital meaning that you have money to start your business. So if you're going to start a business, you need to buy or rent the facility that you're actually going to conduct your business in. You've got to hire workers. You've got to buy the raw materials. You've got to transport your goods at the end. All of this costs money up front before you can actually make your first dollar of profit. So that's where banks come in, making loans. And we know that that first Bank of the United States was created by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, and it was chartered for 20 years. Well, so it goes into effect 1791. The charter is going to end in 1811, and that's while James Madison was president. James Madison did not renew the Bank of the United States. So after that, each of the states began to create their own banks, but these were kind of unsavory institutions, and they were engaged in a lot of corrupt behavior and were just kind of slimy. So after 5 years, it became clear that the economy was struggling largely due to this lack of capital available, this lack of money that could go to start new businesses, that would hire more workers who would then go out and spend more money. So the second Bank of the United States is going to be implemented by this new branch of the Democratic Republican Party that kind of favors this approach to the economy. And so it's also going to be chartered for another 20 years. And then they become competitors with the state banks, and it gets to be kind of a mess. Look at this diagram here. So and you've heard the phrase before, it takes money to make money. So this money, this capital, all right, becomes the seed for this plant that's going to produce more money. So sometimes you'll hear it referred to as, I need seed money to start this adventure or this investment. So it's what you are putting in to then profit more in the end. And this money is coming from the banks. So that's going to be a very clear component where you've got the government making those policies, creating that capital, making that available in these neo-mercantilist systems or neo-mercantilist policies. They also begin to experience here in the early 1800s the first effects of a naturally occurring phenomenon within a capitalist system. There are naturally going to be times when the economy is strong and naturally times where it's going to be weak. And we call this the boom and the bust cycle in capitalism. So watch what happens here. Let's pretend that I own a business and I start producing what could we produce? Refrigerators. All right, so we're going to produce refrigerators and they become all the rage. And there's more demand for these refrigerators than I have actually produced. So I need to up my production. Well, by increasing my production, I'm going to hire more workers. And those workers are going to help me produce more of the refrigerators to meet the demand. But they also now have wages that they're going to go out and spend on other items. So that creates greater demand in other industries, other factories that are producing other items. So then they've got to increase their production and hire more workers who have more money. And so everybody's spending and it just spirals the economy upwards, right? It's a strong, strong economy. We call this the boom. Well, at some point, my production of refrigerators is going to be higher than my demand, because if I keep increasing my production, at some point, I'm going to go beyond where that magic equilibrium would be, where supply would meet demand. We're never actually going to truly meet supply and demand. So once my production goes beyond what the demand is, then I'm losing money. So I need to scale back my operation. I need to not produce as many refrigerators, which means I don't need as many workers. So as I lay off those workers, now they don't have a job and they don't have wages. So they kind of tighten up what they've previously been spending money on, which creates less demand for other products, which means they have to scale back their production and lay off more workers. And pretty soon we're spiraling downward with a decline in the economy. That's going to be the bust part of the cycle. So at some point, we've scaled it back too far to where now there's not enough refrigerators. So we've got to increase our production, which means we hire more workers who have more money, who then go out and spend, which increases demand in other industries, and then it goes back up. So this kind of up and down cycle is natural in a capitalist system. It's expected, but 1819 was when we were first beginning to see that little dip, that decline from those early efforts at industrialization. And it was a little bit alarming to people, but there was this quick recovery. And so again, we began to see that boom in the bust cycle. So I would know this term because it will definitely come up again next semester when we start talking about the Great Depression and the stock market crash and how all of that figures in. So for now, just know that it is expected that we're going to have periods of decline and periods of success or progress in the economy in a capitalist system. One of the other important features that leads to greater production in the United States and industry-wise is improvements with technology and transportation. We've got to be able to get raw materials and finished products either to the market or to the factory more efficiently. And that's going to require better transportation. Prior to the early 1800s, it was just simply wagons and what you could carry, and you didn't have very good roads. And when it would rain, it was a muddy, muddy mess, and the wagon wheels wouldn't turn. In the north, when the snow would thaw in the spring, you would have just mud for weeks on end, and it was just really a problem to try to transport goods. So the federal government's going to get involved in encouraging these new improved transportation approaches. They start with just making the roads better. And they're also going to make roads that connect more places over longer distances. So look at this national road. The National Road of 1840 is going to be not just a dirt road, it's going to be a road made out of cinder, which is more or less crushed up gravel that you can compact it. So it's not concrete and it's not dirt, but it drains really well. And so this makes the national road very desirable. It starts here in Cumberland, Maryland. And then look, it goes through multiple states, these new states that are being created in the Northwest Territory. And then it will end over here in Illinois. And so this national road is quite successful moving goods. So the federal government is going to supplement the states for their construction of this road that connects multiple states. Then we're going to have new technology come about from Robert Fulton, which is the steamboat. So here is Robert Fulton's first steamboat. It's called the Claremont. And what makes the steamboat so impressive is that not only can it move faster with the current, it also can go upstream against the current with ease. Okay, so you've got this steam power. Prior to the steamboat's invention, it was easy to get goods on a barge and go down the Mississippi River and go with the current of the river. But once you unloaded all of those raw materials at New Orleans, you had to turn around and go right back up the Mississippi River to those areas in the Northwest. Well, to get back and go against the current was really difficult. And if you look at the times, it might take you 2 or 3 months to get from New Orleans back up. So you were only being able to make a couple of trips a year up and down the Mississippi River. You could go down to New Orleans very easily in a matter of days or weeks, but it was going back against the current that was a problem. But once you have the steamboat, it was easy. You were able to make multiple trips, which increases our ability to produce. So it's all well and good as long as you've got a river nearby. So what do you do if there's no river nearby? Then you've still got to transport things over land. And that's where canal building became popular. You were going to, if there wasn't a river, let's create a river. And you're going to dig out the area, you're going to flood it, and then that's going to allow for more transportation where a river was not naturally occurring. These canals are really expensive and difficult to construct. And what are you going to do about a mountain? Can you build a canal across a mountain? You can adjust for elevation in some ways, but not over an entire range of mountains. So that was going to be limiting as well. And right on the heels of this canal boom became railroads. They began to take this idea of steam power and boats, and they put it on wheels, which creates a train. And the railroads are much easier and less expensive to construct. So a lot of the emphasis where it was initially on canal building kind of shifts to the railroads. So let's look at each of these types of transportation individually. The Erie Canal is the main one that I want you to remember in the canal building boom of the early 1800s. It is going to connect Lake Erie here in the Great Lakes region at Buffalo, New York. And this canal, it's a man-made river that is going to go east-west to connect with the Hudson River, which is at Albany, New York. So you're connecting Buffalo and Albany, New York, and then the Hudson River flows directly south to New York City. So this allowed us to get all of these goods that are being grown in the Midwest by water route directly to the port at New York City. And so it was very, very successful. This is an image or a drawing representing one of the communities. All of these little towns spring up along the canal because, again, they can make money by transporting goods on the canal. Here's what the Erie Canal looks like today. It's still in use, and you can see this barge traveling down the canal and the modern highway that goes right across the top of it. So even though the canal boom was brief, the canals were still constructed and they were still of use and still are today, because it definitely allows us to be able to move goods more easily. Okay, so here, let's look at the rates of travel. And a lot of this has to do with the production of canals. So in 1800, we're looking at from New York City, how far you could go in a certain amount of time. So each line is representing, you can go this far in a day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and a week. Okay, so we could go down this coastline all the way down here to North Carolina in a week, but we could only get this far into Pennsylvania. So why is it so much more difficult to go from New York to here in the same amount of time that you can go all the way to North Carolina? Well, it's because of the boats that are going to allow you to go down that coastline. Here, you're having to cross mountainous areas. So 1800, here's our travel, 2 weeks to get down here to Savannah, 4 weeks to get to New Orleans, and then we've got 6 weeks over here in this new Western area. All right, but look what happens by 1830. We're able to go much further with our transportation. And by now we've gotten the Erie Canal, and look what we can do. We can go all the way over here to the Erie Canal much easier in just a couple of days, where here it used to take us a week because that canal has connected us. So here's 1800, 1830. You ready to see 1857? So with this increase in transportation, look how far we can get now. So in one day in New York, we are now able to get all the way over here to Ohio. Well, that's the railroads. So the railroads are coming right along behind the canals, and notice all of these areas that we're able to connect. So there's a huge network of railroads here in the North and the Midwest, some in the South, and some even beginning here into the far West. By this point, we've already acquired Texas and the area out to California, but it's still a little sketchy how far we can get. If we looked at another one of these maps when we get to 1868, 1870, the Transcontinental Railroad would have been completed through the center of the United States that would allow us to get all the way to San Francisco very, very quickly. So because of this rapid ability to transport goods and people, we've got more of an opportunity to connect and specialize in our economy in the different regions. All right, so the steamboat here, Robert Fulton is talking about how far we can go here with the steamboats. And he's saying that it is all due to the steam engine and how fast it can help you to travel. Another important invention that connects us to various locations will be the telegraph. And this is going to connect us in terms of communication. So you've got wires that would connect different places, and then you would have these devices. This would be the device that you would use to send the message. So you would tap out here, and it's got an electric pulse that goes along the wire to the receiving end at some different location, your message, and you send it out in a code. It's called Morse code, named after the inventor Samuel Morse. And so then here it would spit out this little strip of paper with this coded message that you would then decipher and have your information instantly, where before you just had to wait on the mail service, which could take days and weeks, and in some cases months, depending on where you were located. Because of the new connectivity of all of these places, we will refer to this as the market revolution. So I would emphasize this in your notes. The market revolution is the specialization of each region of the United States in their production that all together combines to a new national economy. So all of this is reliant on the other regions. The New England states are going to industrialize and take the raw materials that are coming from the South, in particular cotton by this point, and turn that cotton into finished cloth. So the cotton is woven into, spun into thread, and then the thread is woven into cloth that's then distributed and sold across the country. So the South is selling their raw materials, their cotton, to the New England states, some also being sold to the European countries. And then here, as the population is beginning to grow in the Midwest, we're going to call this area the breadbasket. This is where all the food is going to be grown. The grains, the corn, all of the cattle ranching, all of this is going to start to develop here in the Midwest. And because of our increase in ability to transport goods, then we're going to be able to supply the people living in the New England states that are industrialized. They're going to be fed, not have to worry about growing their own food. People in the South can commit most of their territory and land to cotton cultivation, because that's what's driving the industry in the North, because the food and the grains will be coming from the Midwest. So this is supplying the food to both. The South is providing the raw materials. New England is creating the finished product. And all of this is a national economy. So we're going to call this the market revolution. Revolution meaning change. So it allows the country to specialize in different parts of the national economy. So let's look more closely at this cotton complex, as we call it, that cotton is really the driving force of this market revolution with the industry in the North and the agriculture in the South. A lot of this new idea for industrialization is coming from these two individuals, Samuel Slater and Francis Cabot Lowell, who bring these ideas from England back to the United States for textile production. The Lowell factory is the one that I want us to focus on more closely. So Francis Cabot Lowell is going to open up his mills right along the Merrimack River, which is, it's out from Boston a little ways, but it's right on the coast. And he creates a huge, huge operation here. And what makes the Lowell factory system unique is the fact that you take the raw material and go through all of the steps of production through the finished product in one building. And that's what makes his factory so unique. And it becomes a really, really large operation. Here you can see a sketch of it. You've got the factory buildings, multi-story buildings. You've got boarding houses where the workers will live. And those boarding houses are owned by the factory itself. So most of the labor that he is going to be using comes from young single girls who live in rural areas. And he will advertise to try to convince them to move to Lowell to work in the factory rather than living on their father's farm. Really, the only opportunity these women would have would be to marry the farmer's son down the road and raise a family and work on the farm for the rest of their lives. But look at what Lowell is doing. He's advertising to these young women out in these remote areas, and he's got diagrams like this. How many multi-story buildings have they even seen? Probably not very many. And look at the people here in the foreground. They're just kind of strolling along. It looks really leisurely. You've got these handsomely dressed men, and they're thinking, wow, I could go to Lowell, the big city, which really wasn't a big city, but the factory was big. I could go there and I could meet a rich young man, and my whole life trajectory would change. I wouldn't have to marry the farmer's son down the road. I wouldn't have to live on this farm forever. I could just live this brand new life, and I could make my own money. Well, now they've got to convince their dad that they are, that it's a good idea for them to go off and live in this city. And the dad probably wouldn't be really on board with that, because his young virtuous daughter going and living on her own, that's kind of scandalous. Well, one of the other selling features here is that Lowell has these boarding houses that are operated by these women who, they might be widowed or something like that. And they're going to kind of oversee these girls, and there's going to be a curfew, and they're going to be required to go to church, and they're going to be monitored in a way that is wholesome. And it convinces the father that, maybe this daughter who hasn't, she's not going to be able to work on the farm, maybe she could go make some money and send it back home to dad, and everybody's happy. So that's what happens. A lot of young women go there. These are two of the Lowell girls, as they're called, who went to live at Lowell. Well, once they get there, things aren't exactly as they had been presented. So they get there, they move into the boarding house, and then they're given this copy of the Bell schedule. And the boarding houses are right there on the complex where the factory is. So depending on the time of year, there's more sunlight than there is at other parts of the year. So the Bell schedule relates to the amount of sunlight, because we don't have electric lights yet. But there's gonna be a bell that rings at 4:30 in the morning to wake you up. Then there's going to be a second bell that rings at 5:30, which is the time that you're supposed to show up for breakfast that the boarding house mother has created for you. And then the third bell at 6:30 is when the factory starts in operation. So you've got to be standing and ready to go at your station of the factory. Now, what's your job in the factory? Well, you're going to stand there. for 6 days a week for 12 to 13 hours a day. You're going to stand there and watch that machinery go around. And when the bobbin is empty, you're going to put a new one on. And you're going to stand there and you're going to watch it. And when you're going to put a new one on. So it's just really mundane work. You're standing on your feet 12, 13 hours a day. It's noisy. It's dusty. It's not very glamorous. So then they're going to ring a bell at noon for lunch. You're going to walk back over to the boarding house. You're going to eat your lunch. And then at 12:35, they're going to ring another bell for the factory to start up again. And then you're going to stay there until 6:30 at night. Okay, so if I've been there from 6:30 in the morning to 6:30 at night with 30 minutes for lunch, I'm tired. How much strolling am I going to be doing to meet the handsome young man about town? Probably not very much. And we're going to do the same thing tomorrow, and we're going to do it every day except for Sunday. But on Saturdays, you're only going to have to work a half a day. So maybe there's a little bit of time. All right, so this is not what you thought it was going to be, but you're looking forward to your paycheck. So when your paycheck gets here, guess what? That boarding house that you're living in isn't free. So you need to pay your rent to the boarding house. Okay, so here's my salary. Now I'm going to have to give some of it to pay for the boarding house. Now, who owns the boarding house? Lowell does. So wasn't Lowell the one who paid you your paycheck, and now you're having to give some of it back for the boarding house? Okay. And guess what? You ate food in the boarding house. So now you've got to pay for that. Guess who provided that food to the boarding house? Lowell did. So you got to pay a little bit of money back for that. And you know what? Your feet have just been killing you. So you had to go down to the general store and you had to buy some new shoes because your feet were just hurting so badly standing up for this long every day. And so guess who owns the general store? Lowell does. And guess what? You didn't have enough cash to buy those shoes. So you had to buy it on credit. So now you've got to make some payments on that. And so by the time it's all over with, you don't have hardly any of your paycheck left. It's almost like you're working for nothing because of this whole system. So this is called the Lowell factory system. And other industries and manufacturing businesses are going to kind of follow this model. So let's look at, here's what Lowell looks like today. Here's the Merrimack River that comes right up next to the factory. And why would you do that? Well, your finished product, you put it right here out of the factory onto the boat and it's headed out. So that cuts your transportation cost. Same thing with your raw materials coming in. It makes it very efficient. Okay, here is a bale of cotton. So I wanted you to visualize how much cotton is in one bale of cotton. So you've got the cotton plant and then the little balls of cotton that come off, and then you clean it and you put it all together. This makes a bale that is then transported to the factory in the north. To give you an idea of scale, look at this water fountain in the background. So this gives you an idea of just how big a bale of cotton is. Now we're going to look at a map here in just a second that's representing, its dots are representing certain numbers of bales of cotton. So I wanted you to visualize just how big that is. So at Lowell today, they've got this exhibit and you can go and look at industry from back in this early period. And they show you how the string or the thread is woven together through these needles in these racks that go up and down. And depending on the color that you're weaving in between and the pattern of the slats going up and down, each one of these things is a needle and the threads going through each one. And then you put in between different colors and it makes designs. So it could be stripes or it could be, you know, like a chevron pattern or something like that, depending on the pattern of movements of these frames. And you control them manually with foot pedals. Well, industry allows that to become more mechanized later on. So here we are doing this while we're at Lowell visiting. So here it is mechanized. So this is a bobbin. When that one runs out, this one starts in, and then this one and this one and this one. And so it's constantly weaving that cloth. The boarding houses where they stayed, when you go and visit there today, you can actually go in and see where they lived. Here's a photograph of the outside of one of the boarding houses. And so these would have been the Lowell girls who were living there for a period of time working in the factory. And this door frame right here, this is what it looks like today. So you go in and you can see where they live. So there were groups of girls that lived together in each of the rooms. And then you had the house mother who would be in charge of monitoring what was going on. So inside the factory, you've got this cloth that's being woven. and you've got these belts that are turning everything, and they're being rotated by this long pipe that goes along the ceiling, and it's turning itself. And so by this turning, it's rotating these belts that operate the loom, the power loom. And then here's the pipe that comes together, and this wheel and this big giant belt is turning the whole operation. So what happens if one of those parts breaks? Well, everything shuts down. So the operation of the factory has to be monitored by supervisors who are making the schedules, and they're buying the raw materials, they're setting the prices, they're coordinating the transportation, they're overseeing the mechanical working here. They're not actually working on the floor of the factory, but they're in management. And so that's going to create what we call the middle class here pretty soon. They're not owners of the factory getting all the profits, but they're not the low wage earners. There's something in between. They're the bookkeepers, the supervisors, the managers. They're kind of conducting the business for the factory owner who's making all the profit. All right, so now let's look at how this cotton is feeding into these factories. So here's 1850. Every one of those dots is representing the production of 2,000 bales of cotton in one growing season. So when I look at this, it's just heartbreaking to think that all of this is done on the labor of enslaved persons. So when we see this, we see a distinct pattern of cotton production, but not down here in South Georgia. The soil wasn't right there. It wouldn't grow cotton. Too mountainous up here in the north. So we see kind of this belt. It's called the cotton belt or the black belt because of the color of the soil that was necessary for growing all this cotton. So here you can see that it moves through central Alabama, and then there's also a concentration here around the Mississippi River, which is also adding to the ease of transportation of much of this cotton. All right, so look what happens. If that's 1850, we've got the cotton gin that's been produced, but we're going to really begin to ramp up our production for industrialization. Look at 1860. Look at the numbers. All right, again, this is 2,000 bales of cotton. So you can see that there's a shift a little bit farther to the west. Land was cheaper at that time in the west. And so this is where we're going to see really this concentration of cotton production. The map at the top is actually looking at the population distribution of enslaved persons. So where you see blue, that means that the percentage of enslaved persons in the population of that county is greater than the population of whites in the county. Where you see pink, you have a greater white population than you have enslaved persons population. So if we look at this distribution of enslaved persons in the population, it mirrors the very same distribution that we see in cotton production. So these two maps are coinciding with one another. The states in the North have at this point emancipated slavery, ended slavery either immediately through their state constitutions or through the process of gradual emancipation that we've talked about before that happens over a generation. But these slave states in the upper South where cotton doesn't grow, they're not making as much profit as the people in the deep South are making on cotton cultivation because cotton doesn't grow in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, those areas. So they began to see that there's a greater demand for enslaved labor in the South, in the deep South, because of the cotton complex. So they start to get into the business of the domestic slave trade. They begin to take slavery from the upper South and begin to shift and sell those enslaved people into the deep South, into those cotton producing states. And we see this change in distribution. So everywhere that you see green, these states were increasing their enslaved population, where the states in red, it was decreasing. So this is showing us a shift in the 1820s of the distribution of the slave population. A lot of that has to do with the development of the cotton gin and this market revolution with the demand for cotton in the North being much higher. So let's look at this closely. This is something that I want you to pay close attention to. If we're looking at the population, the white population of the South, and we look at the distribution of slave owners versus those who didn't ever own any slaves, we see something that is very important. I think in the minds of many students, when you think back and you visualize the Old South, the antebellum period prior to the Civil War, the image in our minds is that every white Southerner owned slaves and that they had these large sprawling plantations. And that was not really the case. Look at this. Of the white population in the South at the time, 75% of the white population in the South never owned slaves. Say that again, 75% of the white population in the South never owned slaves. And of the 25% who did, look at this small portion who owned more than 50 slaves. So those large plantations that are depicted in kind of, you know, these images of the antebellum South, that was very rare. Monticello, where Jefferson had hundreds of slaves, very rare. Most enslaved persons would have been on a small farm owned by, you know, a white Southerner who was probably farming as well. Now, this isn't excusing it at all. All right. So owning another person is horrific. But my point is the vast majority of white Southerners never owned slaves. So here's my question. Did they not own slaves because they were morally opposed to it, or was there some other reason? And in my mind, it definitely goes to some other reason, because when we get to the Civil War, the vast majority of Southerners who fight in the Confederate Army are coming from this 75% of non-slave holding whites. These people are wealthy enough to be able to hire substitutes. They're not going to be the ones that are fighting out in the infantry. So why would this portion of the population be so committed to the institution of slavery when they didn't even own slaves themselves, and they were so committed to it that they would be willing to fight a war over it? Well, that tells me that if they had the opportunity, this group of people would have become part of this group, because this is where financial gain is located. Because cotton, as we said, cotton was king at the time. That's where the profits were. So to harvest large amounts of cotton, you've got to have a large labor force. So these people were aspiring to be part of this part of the population. In my mind, that is the argument that shows that it was not about a moral dislike of slavery. It was about economic access to producing these large amounts of cotton. So just keep that in mind as we get closer to the Civil War. So what made all of this cotton production possible was the invention of the cotton gin, which is a machine that cleans the seeds out of the cotton. That was what was slowing down the production so much prior to the 1820s. But then Eli Whitney invents this machine. You put the raw cotton in that's got all the really hard, spiky seeds in it. You turn the crank and it has these combs that go through the cotton, and it separates the seeds out here into this drum, and then the fresh, clean cotton comes out on the other side. This is what is baled out, excuse me, baled up and sent to the factories in the North. The enslaved persons who are working in this production of cotton are going to fall under what's called chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the ownership of enslaved persons, and that it is allowed by laws of the area, and it was providing acceptance of slavery within that society, in that Southern society, because the laws protected it. So that's what we mean by chattel slavery. White Southerners became very defensive of the slavery institution as the abolition movement begins in the North. White Southerners begin to try to defend slavery as being appropriate and okay. These are some of the warped arguments that they use to support that. One would be the idea of paternalism. Paternalism meaning that the white Southerners were providing some sort of guidance for enslaved persons, meaning that they were not capable of guiding themselves, which is, you know, when you've not been given opportunity for independence, then how are you able to demonstrate that you're capable of all of this? So it's all kind of perpetuating the cycle. Then as things get even more intense between the abolitionists and the white Southern slave owners, they begin to talk about that with the cotton complex and the demand for cotton from the northern factories, it was necessary. But then they begin to even twist it further and say, but actually it's a positive good, because being an enslaved person, and I'm being sarcastic here, they're saying being an enslaved person, you've got your housing and your clothing and your food all provided to you, where those wage workers in those northern factories, none of that is provided. So it's actually better to be enslaved in the South than to work in a factory in the North, which obviously, again, is warped logic, perpetuating this. So with labor in the North, with these factories, labor begins to kind of, and the factory production begins to adjust how labor is set up. So people who had been very skilled at some sort of a craft, let's say that you were really skilled at making shoes. And I mean, honestly, if somebody told me I had to make my own shoes, that would be a disaster, because I know, and there's nothing worse than having shoes that hurt your feet. So someone who could make shoes that were comfortable was highly sought out in a community. But then when factory production came along, that every pair of shoes was perfectly fit to your foot, then it kind of, and you could mass produce it, it makes it cheaper to buy a factory produced pair of shoes than to go to the local shoemaker and buy a pair of shoes that person's made by hand, because they're going to be charging a premium for that. So they were kind of losing business where they had previously been pretty comfortable in their way of life in their communities. So these artisans, these skilled craftsmen begin to say, you know, we're losing some of our independence and our influence in the community to these factories. This is getting into, and they begin to claim this economic theory of value, meaning that the amount of labor that goes into producing a certain commodity, that labor should be rewarded with the wages that are earned, right? In the factory worker is getting a fraction of the profits that are coming out of those factories. Lowell is keeping all the profits for himself, not the wage earners. So this economic theory of value is saying that it needs to, that the amount of labor that goes in to produce a commodity should be reflected in the wages that the labor is earning. And that was not happening. So as this economic theory of value is taking hold and the workers believe that they're now being taken advantage of, then they start to protest. And the very first organized strike of labor that we see happens in the Lowell factory, where the Lowell girls will go on strike. Their wages were cut, and they organize themselves and they walk out and protest, basically saying that if you're not going to listen to our demands, then we're not going to operate your factory, and then you lose money. So you're better off negotiating with us and getting your factory back up and running. So they write a lot of information, and they explain what they've got. They've actually got their own association with bylaws and a constitution. And the Lowell Offering is a collection of essays and written work where the factory girls are lamenting their situation here. They were being replaced really by Irish immigrant workers who were moving in large numbers to the United States in the late 1830s and into the 1840s. And the immigrants were willing to work for lower wages than the girls were. And so that's why their wages were being cut, and they go on strike. Now, they don't really get everything that they want out of the strike, but it's the first example that we have of an organized system of labor going on strike and working together. So here is the change in immigrant status. Look at the vast number of Irish immigrants that are moving into the United States in this mid 1800s timeframe. They're largely being brought here or coming here due to the Irish potato famine. That's going to be one of the push factors. The factory opportunities that are in America would be the pull factors. German immigrants are also in large numbers, and that would be due to the political unrest that's taking place at that time. So all of these new immigrants are going to be settling in the cities. And we see the growth of cities. This is where the factory jobs are located. They're going to be renting in tenement houses like apartment buildings that become vastly overcrowded as there are more and more immigrants moving into the United States. So we can see just the incredibly large numbers that come in between 1820 and 1840 into these certain cities in the north. So these are some images. There's a great museum in New York City today, the tenement houses, which is where the immigrants began to concentrate themselves close enough to be able to walk to work. And then, but the problem is that they become very overcrowded. So this is the housing arrangement. You would have multiple families all living in each one of these tenement houses, incredibly crowded. And as a result, look at what we see. So this is New York City. This is from a little bit later. So this would be more like the 1880s, 1890s-ish, but it's still the same idea where you've got these tenement buildings with incredibly large populations of people crammed together. You've got big problems with sanitation, big problems with health and disease that was spreading rampantly. You've got problems with crime. You've got all kinds of issues that are going on, corruption going on in these inner city areas. So this is this particular street. This is Mulberry Street in New York City in the 1800s. And here's that same street today. It's still an apartment building. It's still lived in by people living in New York City. Not nearly the congestion that you had before, but it's the same street, which I thought was kind of an interesting shot when I was there. So the last thing that we want to mention will be the various social classes that will emerge and how those social class structures will be different in the South versus the North. And again, all of this has to do with the cotton complex. So with the social structure in the South, we see the cottonocracy or the planter class. I would know the term planter. When you hear the term planter, that's referring to that really, really top portion of the population that owns large numbers of slaves that makes the most profit off of cotton cultivation. Then you have some small farmers who are may or may not own slaves. But then you have these poor whites who don't even own any property. So these people may own their own land, but it's a small plot of land. And probably subsistence farming, maybe a little bit of cash crop production, but certainly not nearly on the range of the upper class, the planter class. So these people wouldn't even own land. Then you have the free Black population that is fairly small. By 1860, there's 200,000 living among all of the states in the South, and they're usually concentrated together in certain areas, more so in the North. And then you have the enslaved population. Notice this, making up 1/3 of the South's population. So remember that 3/5 compromise where you've got all of those population numbers figuring into representation. So because of that, you've also got protection of the slave system with the legislature being dominated by those southern states with all of these large numbers of people being added into their representation number. All right. In the North, however, look what we see. We see that upper class, but we see the middle class emerging. So these would be factory workers, immigrant workers, poor laborers in the North. But then we've got this middle class. These would be, like we talked about before, the supervisors, the bookkeepers, the managers of the factory, not the factory owners and not the labor in the factory, but the group in between. So they're making a decent living and they make enough money to not have to live in that urban tenement housing situation that was so dirty and noisy and everything else. So they had enough money to move a little bit farther out. So they're going to start to see the cropping or the creeping in of suburbs, not really true suburbs at this time, but at least moving out a little bit from the inner city tenement housing. We see gender roles start to change because as these middle class individuals and these upper class women have money, they're able to hire workers to perform all of the domestic duties that they normally would be doing themselves. So they have more leisure time on their hands. And with more leisure time, then they're going to get into other activities. They're going to become more politically active. They're going to be buying more finished clothing and reading magazines and all of these kinds of activities that you wouldn't have seen before when they were all working to just survive. And then you've got this lower class down at the bottom. So again, you've got farmers that are probably not going to be in large numbers here in the north. But the market economy is what's making this happen. You don't really see much of a middle class in the south. You see that more in the urban areas of the north because of the industrialization. All right, so let's stop there with chapter 8. So we really focused on the specialization of production in the market revolution. So each region of the country is fueling the economy of all of the others. So they have to work collectively for the United States to profit. So until next time, keep reading and go make history.